All right, so this is my last contribution to this section of the New Astronomy class series. This is the fourth in a series on part 2 of Kepler's New Astronomy. And I had said in the outline for the work that I wanted to, after having gone through part 2 of the New Astronomy, look at Kepler's New Astronomy, or part 2 of Kepler's New Astronomy, from the standpoint of Cusa and Cusa's De Docta Ignorantia. I'll have to just start out saying from the beginning, I didn't quite get as much time, as I'd been quite busy with what Lynn's put on the table for us the past couple weeks. So I didn't quite have as much time to prepare on the Cusa angle as I would have liked to. But I thought what I would do is focus a little bit more on Lynn's concept of the triad, the first triad, and how the New Astronomy and Cusa's work and Brunelleschi fits into what Lynn's presented as this unique concept of the triadic nature of scientific revolution, which is a pretty provocative conception he's developed, defined, and put forward on the relation between the very large, the very small, and the resolution with Kepler. So I don't know how long it'll be exactly, but I want to just touch on some conceptions there, touch a little bit on Cusa's work, but not quite go into as much depth as I had initially hoped to be able to do. But there'll be plenty more opportunities. And but to get started, I thought there's a few people actually did their homework. Some brave souls out there took the time to relay their thoughts out here. So that was useful. Certainly could use a lot more. And I think if people really want to get an understanding of Lynn's method and Lynn's thinking, then that, I just want to reemphasize, that homework work is indispensable and should be taken very seriously, to take the time to actually fight through in your own thoughts, in your own mind, these questions, and working on communicating these questions and these ideas. So I wanted to reference a couple things that came in for the homework from last week's work, which was the completion of part 2. And in particular, I thought people would have some fun with the last question, which was elaborate the difference between focusing on a subject, say in this case Mars, versus focusing on how a subject is understood. Can you think of similar examples of a similar distinction, either in need or in practice, for current areas of science or economics? And I think that gets at the heart of what Kepler addresses here in Book 2. I mean, I think people at this point should have a pretty clear sense that Kepler takes a very dramatically different approach than anybody else before him. And whereas all the prior scientists, astronomers, Brahe, Copernicus even, investigated the subject of Mars, they never investigated their method of investigation. They just followed on the predefined, or let the previous assumptions live vicariously through their own activity. But they never put the subject on the assumptions and the methodology used to define the nature of investigation itself, and just proceeded in this geometrical world without questioning the nature of the investigation. So obviously what Kepler does is shatter that entirely, and proves that that the flaw was not looking at Mars, but it's how you look at Mars, and the way in which every astronomer prior to Kepler looked at Mars made it impossible for them to ever understand Mars. He proved it was impossible for them to ever have any real knowledge of what is actually occurring, because of the assumptions that they used in their investigation. And what I want to get into towards the end, from the standpoint of the triad, is also then step back and ask a subsuming question to that, which is, what is the ontological, so to speak, nature of the assumptions that these prior astronomers had employed, and what are the implications of the failure of those assumptions? So we'll get into that a little bit, but I thought first, one person submitted one idea of the difference between looking at a subject and asking how a subject is understood. They provided the example of weather forecasting, which I thought was fun, saying if you just take the standard assumptions that weather is completely defined by Earth processes alone, then you're going to be stuck in a certain framework. And if you don't step back and re-examine, well, what are all the factors involved in determining weather on Earth? Namely, including considering the activity of the sun and the solar system and the activity of galactic influences, then you're going to be predefined to a framework that's never going to allow you to understand everything. So that was certainly I think a useful example to play with. I had suggested, in addition to that, another parallel or similar example could be the assumption in much of modern science is the existence of a universal law of entropy. So if you're assuming that entropy is the governing process of the entire universe, that's certainly going to bound all of your conceptions about weather, climate, etc., to a false axiomatic framework. Versus if you understood the universe as a developing anti-entropic process, which is moving towards higher states of organization and higher levels of energy flux density, that would clearly give you a very different conception of weather and climate. So anyway, so that was kind of a fun example to play with. And I still encourage people to look at this and these other questions more and put some more thought into these, because it's very useful exercises. I mean, the obvious one that could be drawn out and has a lot of immediate practical and strategic importance is just the conception of economics. The idea that money has any value. If you take that as an assumption that money or any type of monetarism can actually measure and determine and have any intrinsic measure of economic processes, then it doesn't matter what you do, you're never going to be right. Whether you're conservative policies, liberal policies, whether you believe in trickling up or trickling down or whatever trickling is going on in whatever locations of these professors, it doesn't matter at all, because you're operating from an equant and a circle, which can never measure the principle of what's actually occurring, can never actually measure the principle. You're never going to have any truthful understanding of economics if you don't start with the power of the human mind in the universe and the power of human creative discovery. If you don't take that as your central governing principle and develop an insight into the nature of human creative processes and the effect of human creative processes on mankind's relationship to the universe around him, you don't have any science of economics at all. You just have statistics and projections and extrapolations, but you have no science. So I think these are things that can be used not just to inform our thinking, but it's now, obviously, with what's happening in the world, these are very important concepts to have and to be able to really organize with and shake people's axioms and shatter people's belief systems with what's going on in the world. Then I wanted to reference another homework answer that came in to then, because I think this will lead into the bulk of what I'm going to go through this evening. And again, I don't know how long this will be in full, but I would absolutely hope there's certain questions or thoughts or comments from people having now spent a number of weeks focusing on this class series. So the discussion will be a very important part of this process. But to transition into the focus on this last class and the subject, and slightly redefined subject for this last class, read a couple, just 2 sentences from one of the other answers I got a couple days ago. This person wrote and said, this method of using observational paradoxes. So obviously we're talking about what Kepler does in part 2, the contradiction he gets between the vicarious model and the latitudes, and the ability of that contradiction to show that the assumptions employed in that entire methodology are false. So this person says, the method of using observational paradoxes to unveil the unseen truth is how Kepler communicates the true orbit of Mars. Mr. LaRouche would call this metaphor. So I certainly think that's a very good, part of a good answer, a good response to the homework question. But I think it's getting a little bit, it's actually jumping a little bit ahead, and I think it's useful to kind of situate where we are in Kepler's work, in Kepler's revolution here, because we've gone through the first 2 parts of the new astronomy. We've demonstrated this fundamental earth-shaking contradiction that proves that the entire Kepler is wrong, cannot be possible, can never contain truth. But to then say, this is how Kepler communicates the true orbit of Mars, is not, we're not quite there yet, are we? We know what Mars can't be. We know what the orbit can't be yet, but we don't necessarily know what it is yet. And you know, Kepler himself has this beautiful quote that's been referenced many a times. I'm sure most people have heard it before, where he says, the testimony of the ages confirms that the motions of the planets are orbicular, and it is an immediate presumption of reason, reflected in experience, that their gyrations are perfect circles. For among figures it is circles, and among the bodies of the heavens for among figures it is circles, and among the bodies in the heavens, and among the bodies, the heavens, that are considered the most perfect. So among figures, circles are most perfect, and among bodies, the heavens are most perfect. So therefore it makes sense that the motions of heavenly bodies are circular, because of this concept of perfection. However, when experience is seen to teach something which deviates from a simple circular path, it gives rise to a powerful sense of wonder, which at length drives men to look into causes. So that's where we are right now. We should be invoked with this powerful sense of wonder. That, as Kepler states it, we now have this glaring irony, this contradiction, which should evoke in the mind a sense of curiosity, wonder, to discover, well, if this is not what's happening, then what is happening? What are the causes? What does govern the planetary motions? So that's going to be the next 2 parts of the new astronomy. Kepler now has been, the chains of sense perception, so to speak, have been broken. But now we're left to consider and figure out what actually is real then. If, as I'm going to get into, if these sense perceptual notions do not work, and if we cannot understand cause in the universe from the standpoint of these sense perceptual or sense perceptually related notions, then we're certainly left with another question, which is, can the human mind actually know things? Can we know cause? Can we know principle in the universe? And we are right now left with that question having been posed, and we have not yet found the resolution to that. We've been set up. The question has been posed. The irony has been presented, but we have yet to find the resolution. We've yet to discover what the human mind can generate, not from sense-perceptual notions, but from the human mind itself, that can be consistent with the nature of the universe itself. So that's the question that we have now presented before us. So again, I wanted to take a little bit of time. This might be relatively short, but and look at this from the standpoint of what Lynn's presented as the triadic conception of science and the triadic conception of the Renaissance and the beginning of modern science. And he might have had some very similar conceptions over the past decades, for all I know. I certainly haven't read every single thing he's ever written. And wish I have, working on it. You know, there's a lot in there. But relatively recently, he presented this conception of the work of Brunelleschi, Cusa, and Kepler as defining a set, as defining an interacting, interdependent set of developments which defined the Renaissance and defined modern physical science and the modern age of humanity. And he said you had Brunelleschi's work, which, as he emphasized, focused specifically on the very small. Brunelleschi focused on the activity of the very small. Cusa then dealt with the issues of the very large, the maximum. And Cusa tackled that domain conceptually. And you had then Kepler coming along a bit later. And from the standpoint of what Brunelleschi demonstrates in the small and what Cusa demonstrates in the large, defined a certain paradox. And I would argue that it's the paradox that I just stated just a minute ago. And it is Kepler that comes and finds the resolution, as Lynn states. Lynn states that Kepler defines the resolution to the work of Brunelleschi and Cusa. So I wanted to pull up a few quotes from Lynn regarding this.
Hey, Ben?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was unclear on what the paradox is between Cusa and Brunelleschi.
I'll get into it. I'll go through it again. The way I had stated it before was the paradox of where we're left with Kepler's work right now. Kepler has demonstrated that circular action and uniform motion cannot, the universe, physical processes in the solar system, actual scientific processes, do not exist in that framework. And if you reflect upon that for a minute, it's clear to see that you're looking at notions of geometrical notions, so to speak, or notions that correspond to certain human sense-perceptual conceptions. You know, where does circular action, where do circles exist, but from the standpoint of human visual space, geometry, so to speak? Where does uniform motion exist outside of a human conception of a sense-perceptual notion of some idea of uniform time or continuous, unchanging time? Those might be the conceptions that govern the universe. That's what we're investigating. we do know those conceptions are intimately tied with and connected to and ultimately really derive from, sense perceptual conceptions. But then what we've seen with Kepler's demonstration in part 2, which is, as we'll see, a continuation of the notions of Kusa and the work of Brunelleschi, Kepler shows the universe cannot exist from the expressed as an expression of these conceptions. That the motions of the planets are not governed by these types of conceptions. So, in a sense, we've, as I said, broken the chains of sense perception. We've shown that these sense perceptual conceptions cannot work. This doesn't work. Geometry alone doesn't work. We need some conception of physics, of physical cause, of principle. But we haven't yet found out what that is yet. And I would add, I think the real profundity comes in asking the deep question: can human beings, can the human mind actually have that resolution? If our access to understanding of the universe is not mediated through sense perception or sense perceptual notions, then what basis does the human being have, or the human mind have, or humanity have, to have any access to truth at all? Can we know anything? Can we actually know cause? Can we know why things happen in the universe? I mean, you can have very, simple things in your day-to-day life. I know if I do this thing, I expect a certain reaction. But if you're talking about real fundamental processes of physics, such as the motions of the planets and the organization of the solar system, are these things understandable in their essence as what makes them what they are by the human mind? And if we know that we cannot access that truth as a deduction from sense perceptual conceptions, then that poses a very serious question and problem. What would be the basis for our access to knowledge then? So I would argue that is the same. They certainly, Kusa especially, poses a very clear thesis in resolution to that. But then Kepler kind of comes along with the demonstration of that, or the resolution to the issues that Kusa poses, and then in conjunction with what we can understand from what we have access to regarding the work of Brunelleschi. So to start on that track, I want to just give away the answer. And I'm going to give away the answer by giving Lynn's answer. And these are some notes that I've kind of compiled. Let me pull this up on the screen here. These are some notes I've compiled from some discussions that Lynn's had either in the basement or other locations over the past number of months. This is from February of this year, so a few months ago. And it's when I think this is around the time, roughly, I could be a little bit off, but I think it's around the time when he was talking about first talking about this idea of the triads and the importance of the first triad. So let's read this, what Lynn says here. Lynn says, it's very simple. Eliminate the whole idea of statistics and all such things. Let's just eliminate them. And also sense perception. You have to eliminate them as factors. You can treat them as phenomena. They're symptoms of phenomena, but they are not a principle. And that's the whole point of the thing. The only thing that we know is mankind. We don't know anything but mankind as a subject. Everything we know depends upon our understanding of mankind. And this is demonstrated most clearly in the history of physical science. really the best history since the Renaissance, which has always one thing, that mankind is the measure of man's knowledge of the universe. Therefore, you have to derive from mankind the knowledge of the universe, rather than trying to take some data and trying to measure by data. You can't measure by data. You have to measure everything by man. See, the point is, people say, you have sense perception. You have facts, sense perceptual facts. But they are not evidence. You have to qualify what the so-called facts mean. What determines those facts to be facts? You cannot do that from facts, because everything that's important to us that we discuss involves the human mind. And the human mind is a social phenomenon. A human social phenomenon. Therefore, you can only judge everything by human standards. And you don't judge by sense perception. You judge by the effect of man on the universe, and how the universe responds to man's intention to deal with it. And you never have a complete story. You never have a total picture. Every time you turn around, you're always discovering a new principle in the solar system. Or at least if you're doing any work, you are. So again, that was from a discussion Lynn was having in the basement back in February, some back and forth. This is kind of the beginning of some of what he's getting at with the triads, and I thought this would be a very kind of provocative and difficult concept just to put out that people I think should really struggle with and fight with, because this is the essence of Kepler's resolution, of Cusa's work, of the triadic interaction between Cusa, Brunelleschi, and Kepler around the failure of sense perception to define science, and the discovery, hypothesis, and demonstration that the human mind itself does have a certain other capability outside of sense perception, which we can know to be true, we can know to be valid, because we can demonstrate the ability to discover and wield and utilize what we would call universal physical principles. And we can know the validity of that process by our ability to change and improve our relationship with the universe around us. So, we'll go to the second quote here, where Lynn discusses Brunelleschi. This was from, when was this from? This is from March, so about a month later. Again, this was a discussion we were having with him in the basement. He had initially started posing explicitly this idea of these two triads of science and defining this as a challenge that we should take on. Can't remember, I don't have in my notes what he said before this, but apparently somebody posed the wrong idea of a triad. Because Lynn starts, at least this quote I have here, Lynn says, no, not that kind of triad. It's a minimum point, a maximum point, and a resolution. So in order to estimate a principle of space, that is physical space-time, you have to have at least 3 points. One is the minimum point, the true minimum point, and Brunelleschi's discovery of principle was crucial because he went completely outside any calculation. Yes, he made an empirical examination, but his principle was not that. His principle was the introduction of curves and proved that lines do not exist in space. His effort was on the minimal point. Brunelleschi's work was on the minimal approach to eliminate so-called curves. The idea that you cannot use a straight line in space, you cannot use a geometry in space. Geometry is useless in space. You have to have ontological characteristics. And the only ontological characteristic you have is not measurement. It is maximum minimum and minimum maximum. And minimum maximum has to have a resolution. Again, kind of pulling these things a little bit out of context, but I want to just take Lynn's emphasis there on Brunelleschi and just kind of pull out at least what insight I have into it. And, you know, I think the key to looking at Brunelleschi's work here is a quote. I can't recall if we know who it's attributed to exactly. Perhaps Alexander or Jason would know. But upon discussing what Brunelleschi does in the construction of his dome, it was said that every stone is a keystone, or every stone is the keystone in the construction of his dome. Now, people, I assume, have an idea what the keystone is. If you have a regular arch, kind of a simple arch structure, the whole thing is unstable until you put in the one stone at the very top, called the keystone, which then immediately allows the whole thing to support itself. And if you don't have that stone in place, the whole structure will fall in on itself. It's not self-supporting by its own characteristics until you get that keystone in place. So if we're talking about Brunelleschi's construction of the dome, we're talking about, and if we're saying every stone is the keystone, then you're saying that every stone equally expresses the support of the whole. That in the small, to build this dome, to build it so it's self-supporting as it's constructed, to build it as this massive, huge structure at the time that can support this massive amount of weight, but to do it in a way where it's self-supporting as it goes, it was noted that every stone is a keystone. Every stone in the small, the construction in the small, reflected the whole, reflected the organization of the totality. So Brunelleschi had to use a method in order to be able to do this, which expresses that principle, where every single stone is an expression of the whole, and that is a principle you see very clearly with the catenary, where if people have played with the catenary, you know that if you take away lengths of the string, or if you add lengths of the string, in a catenary, in a continuation of a catenary curve, then the whole doesn't change. The rest of the chain, if somebody's holding a catenary and someone pinches off a lower part, and you let go of where it was being held prior, the rest of the chain doesn't change, because every part in the small is already reflecting, in a certain sense, the curvature of the totality. So the same general principle of action had to be employed in the construction of the dome, where the whole had to be self-supporting in the process of construction, couldn't wait for some final keystone to come in at the very end to support the entire thing. But the entire thing had to express that process. So in order to perform a certain, it's been described, I think we had described it as an Apollo project of the 15th century, a massive undertaking of human effort, a massive demonstration of the power of human scientific thought, of human architecture, of human capabilities, in order to accomplish this huge undertaking successfully. This was the method that Brunelleschi had to employ. And I think what Lynn sees in it, as he's saying very clearly here, when you look at what type of action or type of change in the small that was required to do that, to enable that construction, to enable this massive, grand demonstration of human capability. You could not do it with lines. You could not do it with circles. You could not do it with geometrical conceptions. That we can have these conceptions, we can utilize them. You can utilize them in simple basic architecture. When it comes to trying to create this self-standing and self-standing as it's being constructed structure, you had to act upon a certain curvature or characteristic of the physical process you're dealing with. And what we see expressed in that process was the fact that geometry does not exist. Geometry, again, does not encapsulate the character of actual physical action in the universe. That here we're clearly dealing with construction in a gravitational curvature, the curved space of geometry. And we see that the nature of what enables mankind to be able to perform action in this physical geometry has nothing to do with sense-perceptual geometrical characteristics, but it again requires something completely different outside of geometry. So here you have an expression in the very small. The failure of sense-perceptual notions to enable mankind to perform actions you wouldn't be able to perform otherwise. And the demonstration that you have what becomes an expression of what you would call non-geometrical curves, or non-geometrical methods of, or principles of curves, involved in the giving mankind the power to build this construction. So you have a certain demonstration of the collapse of sense-perceptual or geometrical constructions or conceptions as having any physical efficiency in the real universe in the very small. And then you look at what Kuza dealt with. And again, I had intended to take a little bit more time to review what Kuza writes in De Docta Ignorantia in greater depth, but I've been somewhat overloaded with the fact the whole world is going through a fundamental revolution, and a lot of it is on our shoulders, that I wasn't able to put as much time as I wanted to into this. But it's certainly the case that Kuza is dealing with these conceptions on the very large. And I'm sure people have, through the Kepler work we've done so far, should have been exposed to at least some of Kuza's quotes. I actually don't even have them right here in front of me. But Kuza comes himself to some very revolutionary conclusions about astronomy and about the motions of the planets, based upon his methodological approach, so to speak. And he states clearly that he hypothesizes that these geometrical conceptions will fail and will not be able to exist in the motions of the planets. That there cannot be a center to the planetary system, to any planetary orbit. That there cannot be circular orbits that govern the planets. Things that Kepler then later demonstrates, but Kuza is able to forecast, so to speak, that this would be the case, and he's able to do it based upon his method of learned ignorance, in which he tackles very explicitly the idea of the very fundamental conceptions of action in the very large and the very small. Find my notes here. And he specifically addresses this idea of absolute perfection, and any form of absolutes, and any form of an absolute maximum or an absolute minimum. He divides his De Docta Ignorantia into 3 books. The first book deals with what he calls what is the absolute maximum, the conception of something, a maximum of which nothing can be greater, which he concludes could only be God and nothing but God. In the second book, he deals with what he calls the maximum expressed contractedly, or the maximum expressed in parts, which he calls the universe, which is where he makes these forecasts of the fact that you will not have, that planets cannot be circular orbits, that you cannot have a point of uniform motion, that you cannot have fixed centers in the planetary orbits. And then the third book, he deals with his conception of a certain resolution to this paradox, which is where does mankind exist in this universe, and deals with the idea of mankind being a mediation between the absolute maximum and the contracted maximum, and mankind having itself a capability to have access to these higher conceptions because of the creative capabilities of the human mind, and because of the expression of that through Jesus, as he discusses in great detail. So in that you have what Lynn described as the very large expression in the maximum and the very large of the, again, breakdown of these sense perceptual notions, these geometrical notions. That in the physical universe, to kind of put it simply, as Kuza argues, you can never have something so perfect that it couldn't be more perfect. And as soon as you posit that as an argument and begin to investigate that, you immediately are eliminating any potential of geometry to actually exist as a determining cause in the universe. Because geometry deals with perfect circles, perfect straight lines, perfect center points. And as Kuza discusses in his works, these things can't actually exist. And therefore they can't, the processes in the universe are not going to be understood and governed by these processes. And so you have in Kuza's work, again, a shattering of this idea of sense perceptual notions existing in the very large. And then you have, as Lynn, so this is these two kind of base points of the triad. And then I think it's very interesting that Lynn defined Kepler's work as a kind of resolution to this, you could call it a paradox, I would call it a paradox posed by the work of these guys. That we now have, clear arguments and demonstrations that mankind cannot have access, again, to knowledge of the universe through these conceptions of sense perception. And with Kepler's discoveries, and I would emphasize that this is what he does in the New Astronomy in its entirety. Again, we're kind of at this paradox point right now. So we're about to embark upon the initial resolution to coming to a discovery of what governs the orbit of Mars, and an initial demonstration that the human mind can actually have access to and demonstrate a capability to know what governs the motion of the planets in the universe. But then also, especially also, his harmonies of the world, where he deals with the solar system, the planetary system in its entirety as a single process. You have a resolution through a demonstration that, yes, the human mind, despite the fact that we can demonstrate and know that sense perception is false, yet we can know that the human mind does have still yet another faculty, another capability. We can demonstrate that mankind can still act as a physically efficient force in the universe. And as Lynn said in this earlier quote, said to the effect of through our ability to demonstrate creative capabilities. That we can know mankind can create entirely new conditions and new states in the universe, which does indeed demonstrate that mankind does have some inherent capabilities to know the universe and to be a creative force in the universe. But we know that is not accessed through sense perception or any deductions from sense perception. So I want to pull up one more quote, two-part quote from Lynn here, and then open it up. Sift through the reports here. So this was just a little bit later in this same discussion from March when he was down in the basement. And Lynn says, as Kepler proves, you don't have any measurement in space as such. That is, you cannot define or derive from an ordinary geometry. You cannot use that to define space. So the solution to this problem was the minimum brought in, the minimum concept, which was brought in by Brunelleschi, who proved that construction did not depend upon any known curve at the time. It was a curve that was independent from all these geometric measurements. All right. So then Kuza proved the same thing for the maximum. There is no maximum point that satisfies the requirement. Now, therefore, you have to have a resolution. What you have is the minimum maximum question. What you have is the minimum maximum question, which becomes the solution which is unique to Kepler. Because Kepler did not derive a deductive result. He defined a point, an area of space, a space curvature. But you had no deducible characteristics. And that is the point. You solve the problem of this crap by going to things which are not definable as measurable quantities. And he goes on a little bit later. And he says, you apply it to the human mind. And the human mind tells you how that works. Because the argument, competent science is always based on the reflection of the model provided by the first available triad of this type, the first ontological triad, which did not depend upon some fixed geometry. That is your first measurement. So what you do is you track the evolution of what you've discovered about space. You say, this is what space-time is. You get it generally. It is in one form, which people say is mystical, because the mathematicians don't like it. It comes from the fact that you have things which you call physical principles. Now, physical principles can be used as a term for garbage, but physical principles means a principle of space, which is independent of measurements, except in effect. In other words, you have an effect which you cannot account for as a derivative of your calculations, but it is there. So it's a principle because it is universal. That is what we're supposed to mean when we say physical principle. A physical principle which should conform to a consistency or coherence with a known reference of the type of the Kepler case. So the Kepler case serves for a long time as the standard of truth for physical principle. And all the shitheads I've ever known in science were always opposed to Kepler. And we call it the shithead list. So So I want to just put that on the table to kind of situate where we're at in the entirety of this work. Because as was stated, we've kind of demonstrated I would argue, so far in the new astronomy in particular, we've kind of demonstrated and confirmed the initial work of Brunelleschi and Cusa. We've come to a specific, another demonstration of the failure of geometry or sense perceptual notions, this time in a very rigorous application to the specific case of the orbit, the actions of Mars, the characteristics of change of Mars's orbit. But we've yet to come to the resolution, which Lynn was just defining here, which is Kepler's discovery. His generation in his mind of a conception which is consistent with the actual characteristic of action which governs a planetary stellar system. A conception that Kepler generates in his mind which enables mankind to have a greater power of action in the universe. So reflecting back on the first quote of Lynn I was reading, the fact that to understand knowledge, we have to understand that the human mind for mankind is the source of knowledge. That you cannot go from sense perception. You cannot go from measurements, as Lynn was just saying in this last quote, to knowledge. That fails. It fundamentally fails. It cannot work. What you have to go to is a kind of eerie realization that the human mind has capabilities that sense perception does not. That the human mind has capabilities that are outside of and not contained within any form of sense perception. And despite the fact that you can't logically deduce knowledge from sense perception, mankind can generate conceptions by the powers of the human mind. And we can know and demonstrate, especially in Lynn's science of economics, we can know and demonstrate that the human mind, that these generations of the human mind enable mankind to be, so to speak, in a qualitatively higher degree of harmony with the universe, a more truthful resonance with or interaction with the universe, which, today we could express very clearly in potential relative population density. We can demonstrate that mankind can fundamentally change his relationship to the universe and move to a fundamentally more powerful, higher order relationship to the universe as a function of the capabilities of the human mind, uniquely, not through sense perception. So we're at the point now where we've demonstrated that, again, in line with Cusa and Brunelleschi, we've demonstrated that sense perception does not exist, and we're kind of sitting now with the paradox, the contradiction in hand, to then move to hypothesize and work through with Kepler the development and generation of the resolution, which is the discovery of the universal principle of gravitation. And I think the highest reflection of all of this is the fact that this actually tells us more about the universe and what the universe is. Forget all your cosmology that says the universe is a bunch of gas in a big empty box that they can simulate in supercomputers. What we actually know about the universe, the most we know about the universe, is the fact that the human mind, not sense perception, but mind, the human mind specifically, can interact with, so to speak, the universe to generate new states, higher states that wouldn't exist otherwise. So we know the universe from the standpoint of the fact that it's actually resonant with the human mind. And the basis of knowledge for mankind, as Lynn was saying, is the human mind itself. And that is the conception that's clearly lacking in science and society today. And Lynn, I think, has referred to this as the Renaissance conception, more or less, in certain discussions over the past month or so. And he's made the point that, this Renaissance conception, this higher understanding of the nature of mind and science and the organization of society around this conception, has been an active factor since the Renaissance up through today. And it's had ebbs and flows, and it's had periods where it's been attacked and pulled back, but then you see resurgences of this conception. Leibniz was a resurgence of this conception. The work of Gauss and then Riemann was a resurgence of this conception. And you can trace it up to this second triad that Lynn defined, which he draws out this beautiful parallel expressing, as if a higher principle to this whole triadic conception. That you had the work of Planck in the small, Einstein in the very large, again, both shattering certain sense-perceptual notions, shattering certain assumptions which were intimately tied to and ultimately derived from sense-perceptual conceptions. And kind of between their work and then the emergence of Vernadsky and how far he was able to take it, the beginning of, but not full resolution upon, a higher demonstration of the capability of the resonance of the human mind with the universe on an even higher order. And so, this is ultimately tied to the existence and survival of human civilization, because this is what mankind is. And I think it's entirely appropriate and consistent and necessary that these are the conceptions that we be fighting with and understanding and mastering to inform our political fight in the creation of a new system on the planet and between planets. Because this is the conception that has to govern the new system. And if it doesn't reach this level, it's not really going to be a sustainable victory. That we have to understand and bring forward again this Renaissance conception, this understanding of what the human mind is, what human society is in the universe. And we need to take it to a new level. And that becomes the basis for the potential for a new Renaissance, which we have before us. So I will leave it at that, but I wanted to take some time to put all that on the table, and I think that hopefully gives people a renewed excitement and understanding to continue this working with Kepler through his new astronomy through the next 2 parts, where he begins to deal with the hypothesis and generation of his resolution, the Kepler resolution, to the paradox of part 2. And perhaps, maybe, possibly even inspire more than 3 people to do their homework in any one given week. So with that, I'd certainly be happy to hear any questions or thoughts or other contributions to the discussion, or where Kepler goes from here, or what you didn't understand from the previous parts, or anything. Should we form a line?
Well, no, we were reading book 2 of De Docta here in Seattle, just to kind of look at some of the homework. there's one part in the beginning that kind of stands out. Kind of just wanted to share. I was thinking about Copernicus and why Copernicus philosophically thinks the orbit should be circular.
Mm-hmm.
But it says, this is from book 2. Therefore, one motion cannot be equal to another, nor can one motion be the measure of another, since necessarily the measure and the thing measured differ. Although these points will be of use to you regarding an infinite number of things, nevertheless, if you transfer them to astronomy, you will recognize that the art of calculating lacks precision, since it presupposes that the motion of all the other planets can be measured by reference to the motion of the sun. Even the ordering of the heavens, with respect to whatever kind of place, or with respect to the rising and settings of the constellations, or to the elevation of a pole, and to things having to do with these, is not precisely knowable. And since no two places agree precisely in time and setting, it is evident that judgments about the stars are, in their specificity, far from precise. If you subsequently adapt this rule to mathematics, you will see that equality is actually impossible with regard to geometrical figures, and that no thing can precisely agree with another, either in shape or in size. And although there are true rules for describing the equal of a given figure as it exists in its definition, nonetheless, equality between different things is actually impossible. And then it finishes with this idea on epistemology of can you actually know something, in his idea of learned ignorance, and the end says, wherefore ascend to the recognition that truth, freed from material conditions, sees as in a definition the equality which we cannot at all experience in things, since in things equality is present only defectively. So that was definitely goes hand in hand with this, what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea of again, Kuza's, you really got to take the work in its entirety, and you got to take long sections, because oppose paradoxes and then come to resolutions as he goes. So it's not something that's difficult to pull out particular elements just here or there without a clear conception of the entirety. But this point about not having absolute precision in anything, I think, is fully demonstrated by science today. I mean, we have the actual motions of any planetary body have so many perturbations from other effects that any idea of absolute precise mathematical precision can't fundamentally exist in the universe. We can certainly have increased conception, increased ability at precision of understanding all the influences of the sun, the other planets, ultimately other stars, other gravitational effects from the galaxy on the motion of any one given body. But we're always going to run into a point where, to fundamentally understand the exact characteristic of motion in the small, you're then asking the question of what is the effect of the entire universe on the small. So this idea of having some kind of mathematical precision in mathematical or geometrical terms to any action, can't exist in the physical universe in reality. That we can understand certain principles of action and then the interactions of certain principles of action, but to try and define the entirety of the universe down to the smallest element from the standpoint of any type of mathematical precision and consistency. Kusa here forecasts and has been borne out in modern science doesn't actually work. So again, I think, again, a lot more could be done in taking the time to give Kusa's learned ignorance the depth of treatment and the time of treatment it requires. But I think it really points us back to that initial quote from Lin, which points us back to the power of the human mind as the measure. And this is something he put in his 4 Laws document. This was included as an integral part of his conception of the policies needed to save the United States and the planet, which is that mankind is the measure of the universe for mankind. That we cannot ever know the universe in its entirety from any of these mathematical or geometrical or sense-perceptual notions. But we have to recognize the principle of the fact that mankind's access to new domains of knowledge and higher domains of understanding of the universe, which is the source of science, which is the source of economic growth and profit and value, that the ultimate source of that is not anything at all derived from or related to sense perception, but is solely attributed to the power of the human mind specifically itself. That what we know, what we can actually know to be true, is that we can know that the human mind has the ability to itself generate conceptions which enable mankind to have a greater degree of power over the universe. And that's our basis for truth. And what you see demonstrated in this first triad, again, is that the ability of the human mind to do that is not mediated through sense perception. And I responded to one of the homework questions, encouraging the person to look back at Book 4 of Kepler's Harmony of the World, because he has a beautiful treatment of this there. And he has a very clear and concise treatment of this distinction, this fundamental infinite distinction between sense perceptions and the messages delivered by sense perceptions and the human mind. And he has this clear illustration of the difference between phenomena in the universe, the fact that our sense perceptions only perceive a certain distorted shadow of various aspects, as if a random smattering of certain aspects of that phenomenon, which are then mediated through the body itself, which has its own characteristics. And only then is it presented to the mind. And here is where Kepler says that Aristotle's doctrine is the basis of Aristotle's need to be thrown out of Christianity, which whereas Aristotle says the human mind, the human soul is a blank slate upon which all these notions are just written. So whatever the person perceives, that then determines the mind, and determines the soul, and determines knowledge for the person. Kepler says no, that's not the case. And that idea means that Aristotle does not belong in the Christian religion at all. And the true idea is Kepler's idea of harmony, that the soul can be presented with these sense-perceptual notions, presented, as he describes, presented to the seat of the soul. But all these can do is stimulate the soul to act in its own accord, in its own capability, to itself generate something that itself already has the potential to generate, which becomes the basis of actual knowledge of the universe. That the mind itself can be stimulated to itself do something that only itself can do, to itself generate a conception, which then allows, which can be consistent with what was the ultimate cause or source of those shadows of sense perceptions. But the mind isn't build up a discovery from data given to it through senses, but the mind can be presented with certain paradoxes or evidence or anomalies which can stimulate itself to generate an idea. And the ability of the human mind to do that, to generate a discovery, cannot be reduced to anything else but the study of the human mind per se. And that this becomes, in Kepler it has this whole beautiful discussion of that from the standpoint of harmony and harmonies, and the human mind being itself, in essence, harmony and the creation of harmonies. And that being what enables the human mind to understand the principle of gravitation of the solar system, which is itself a harmonic process. That it's not the delivery of data to the mind of the soul. It's the fact that the soul expresses a potential of creation, of creative action, that is also characteristic of the universe itself. And that becomes our basis for knowledge, for knowing anything.
Yeah. Also in book 2, Kuza, what you're talking about, he really brings up Plato's idea of recollection, which is a very it's the interaction of man's mind with the universe, and how there's universals that are contracted in man's mind, and so certain universals that exist in the mind, they actually manifest themselves, or they unfold themselves through the process of understanding, which is the way you kind of unlock them. But they're already kind of innate in there. He says that that's how they unfold themselves, is through understanding, but that they're already there. So that there is a kind of a structure, or like an isomorphism to the human mind and its relationship to the universe and the way it exists.
Yeah, exactly. And then you see the other expression of that in Kuza's own resolution to this in Book 3 of Learned Ignorance, where he has his own method of addressing the resolution to this paradox, this infinite wall between sense perception presents between the actual universe and the mind, this infinite division, but then coming to the resolution that the mind itself has a different power, a different capability, which enables mankind uniquely to generate and express and carry knowledge. But yeah, absolutely traces very directly back to Plato, and Plato playing with and fighting with kind of certain initial expressions of this investigation of knowledge and the human nature, and what the human mind is, what the human capabilities are. And as Kuza does, so does Kepler put a great emphasis on Plato's conception there in the same Book 4. So yeah, I certainly think between what Plato presents there, what Kuza presents in De Docta Ignorantia, especially in his resolution in the 3rd book, and what Kepler presents in Book 4, The Harmonies of the World, can absolutely be taken as kind of different avenues, interacting avenues, paths to come to the same universal conception. And examining them kind of in parallel, or one after the other as part of the same investigation, will probably, I think, help people understand the conception that they're all dealing with in those. So Is that it? Anything else? Okay, if no one else has any other thoughts, that will wrap it up for this week. Megan Roulard has posted the outline for how she's going to lead people through tackling part 3. So that's now available, and she'll be starting next week. She might be more ruthless than me on the homework, so you guys better prepare yourselves. Okay, I'll talk to you guys later.
Okay, thanks.